The Isaiah passage seems so cheerful, but it's actually a tough one. It asks people to let go of the faith of the past, to pay attention to what God is doing in the present. And while that sounds great and all, for most of us, our faith is deeply rooted in the past, and for good reasons. We're not all that interested in letting it go. And that's the always reason. The 2022 reason builds on it. A lot of us are rather sick and tired of new things, and we would rather be able to settle into some of the old things we miss a lot. Please count me among those who are struggling with this. This week, a small group of us met with a team to talk about the technology that we'll need to move towards live streaming our service. And they asked great questions. And I found that I kept answering with, well, before the pandemic, this, and right now, this, but I don't know what the answer is in 2 years. And I really miss being able to answer simple questions with simple answers. When I think about what our church life looked like in February of 2020, I am astounded at the changes. I can barely remember the simplicity of one worship service, and I did not adequately appreciate the wonder that was being able to be together in a room safely. I sort of remember church night, a time when there were 4 or 5 meetings and we had to figure out who met in what room instead of which Zoom account to use for which meeting. I remember children's times on the steps of the sanctuary when I got to talk to the kids and we could see each other's faces, and I miss it so much. I remember seeing people's faces when I was preaching and getting a sense of what worked and what didn't, and being able to adapt. And I miss that. I miss parking lot conversations, and I'm not even sure I'm supposed to say that. I miss the church office being loud when people ran into each other, and I really miss sustained ministry. I miss choir anthems, and I miss the sound I heard behind me during worship when I erred in following the bulletin and the choir members were trying to figure out if it was important enough to tell me. I miss greeting our breakfast guests at the door and watching people chit-chat with each other. Oh, do I miss communion after church and rushing to finish it so we could get to a second hour. So when I hear, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old, it's a hard line to take in. Those things were sacred. They helped me know my place in the world. They were important and meaningful and lovely, and I struggle to let them go. And I invite you to think about and even name the things you miss. You could even do so in the comments as a way of responding to the sermon. There's a power in naming those things, in acknowledging what we've lost and how hard it is to have lost it. There is something of a scholarly debate over which things of old the exiles were being invited to forget. The way I hear it, they're actually all a bit controversial because ours is a faith that remembers. And yet, for everything, there is a season. So this is a different sort of call. It is a new thing. So some say that what the exiles were being invited to forget, so that they can see what God is up to in the present, is the Exodus itself. God who made a way through the sea. God who saved them from chariot and horse. God who got them free from slavery. They're being told to forget that and watch what God is up to now. And that's a pretty big ask. Others say it's bigger. Others say it is creation itself that the exiles are being asked to forget so they can see what God is up to in the present. That the references to water reflect the acts of creation, of separating the waters and separating the land from the waters. And instead of remembering creation, the exiles are asked to forget that and pay attention to the present, to see what God is up to now, which is a pretty big ask. Still others say it isn't the two biggest foundations of their faith that the people are being asked to forget, but instead it is the destruction and fear of the exile itself, that which most of Isaiah 1-39 was predicting. The exiles are being asked to forget the circumstances by which they came to be exiles in Babylon, and instead to focus on what God is up to in the now, which very well may be the biggest ask of all. Those are some rather enormous things to be asked to forget in order to pay attention to the present. And it rather suggests that we are not exempted from this because of a world-changing pandemic. So, the past being let go of, even at rather exceptional cost, lets us continue in this passage. And now we hear from God, I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself, so that they may declare my praise. The premise of this passage, that holding on to the past can distract us from the ways that God is at work in the present. That's true. And I don't want us to go overboard and throw out the past, which probably isn't possible anyway. But I do want to enter into this idea, this question. Where is God present now among us in new ways? Are we looking for it? Are we paying attention? Have we freed up our spirits and our focus to see what God is up to now by letting go of what we perceived God to be up to in the past? God, as we know, is always pushing the status quo. God isn't going to let up on seeking justice for all of God's beloveds until there is justice and peace and compassion and wholeness for all of God's beloveds. Which means that when the world changes directions, the way God moves among us changes too. The exiles in Isaiah 43 were in a new place. God's advocacy for quite a while had been for them to attend to their own teachings, to create a society with equity, to care for the impoverished and the vulnerable, to dismantle power structures, to provide justice within the justice system, and to disentangle themselves from external empires who would do them harm. And then the exile happened, and the external empire did them harm, and they no longer had the power to enact God's vision in the land, as the exiles weren't even in the land. So God's movement among them was going to be different. God was now planting seeds of hope. God was planting dreams of a just society. God was helping them in the midst of despair. And maybe most of all, God was inviting them to be in their present, to be where they were instead of just grieving where they were no longer. And I think it might be notable that God dreams a future for them in order to help them move from the past to the present. And maybe that's part of what is needed. We need to know where we're going. And that, dear ones, is part of what's so hard right now, because so much remains in flux, and it is far from easy to see where we're going to land. And actually, I think this has been a community struggle for a rather long time. Going back decades, there have been various ways that this church has tried to vision the future, all of which petered out with some form of, but there are too many variables, only to have the process repeated a few years later. So, all right, here we are. There are too many variables to know the future. That is simply true. It has always been true, and my goodness, it has been true that things change fast these days, faster now than ever. I'm aware of this. I've been the one updating the post on the church's Facebook page telling people what worship looks like in our community, and I have lost count of how many updates I've had to make in that over the past 2 years. I wonder if it might be useful to think about what we actually do know. What we know about the present and the future. God is with us. God is faithful. God's steadfast love endures forever. God dreams of goodness, joy, peace, healing, wholeness, justice, and equity for all of creation. And we are on God's team to make that dream a reality. It's pretty much everything I know. I don't know what worship's going to look like in a year or two, or what ministry might emerge out of the community's need and the energy we once put into sustain. I don't know how many access points we're going to have for people to be part of this community, or when we're going to live stream, or when we'll hear from Bishop Karen Oliveto. Right now, I don't even know when we're going to get an applicant for the sexton position, or put together the job description for a permanent musician, or just have church council in person come on Moderna's application for young children vaccines. There's so much that we don't know, and it's hard. And I think that's actually why it's easier to focus on the past, because then we knew and understood or thought we did. But the past can hold us hostage, particularly in moments like this when we are running to it out of the discomfort in the present. God is up to new things today. God is not happy with letting unjust practices and lack of compassion stand. And I know that we want to be attentive to God in this time. So I'm going back to that list of what we know. God is with us. God is faithful. God's steadfast love endures forever. God dreams of goodness, joy, peace, healing, wholeness, justice, and equity for all of creation. God works for the kingdom, if you want it to be shorter. We are on God's team to make God's dreams a reality. And I invite us to center ourselves, instead of in the past, in those truths. You might find that there are a few more that we need to add, and I would be delighted to hear those. Maybe you're one of the ones who can actually see what God is up to right now, and I would invite you to share that, including in the comments. This we know, God is up to new things. This I wonder, are we on board? Amen.